Chris Leithner is a contrarian economist, as he's been described to me by people in other parts of the financial world. We have the same accountant, Chris Leithner, I'd like to let you know. And so we'll be... I'd rather ask Chris to have a look at Phil Williams' economic analysis, which was quite surprising. The word deflationary depression was in his analysis, and it's caused some interesting comments, Chris Leithner. Welcome once again.
Welcome, thank you.
It's good to have you back. Before I ask you to respond to Phil Williams' analysis, there was some interesting sort of market data today, a company sort of half-yearly profit reports. Banks look like they're doing okay. Manufacturing looked pretty lacklustre. And there seems to be sort of mixed news coming from the markets. How does it look from your point of view?
Well, from my point of view, two things to say. One, the dollar amount of a lot of profits. Yes, fair enough. In some instances, they're rising. You mentioned banks and so on. From investors' point of view, their share of the earnings per share, have been falling for 18 months and are continuing to fall. The reason for that basically is a gargantuan number of shares issued, over the past 12 months or so, equivalent to something like 9 to 10% of Australia's economic pie. And those two things can weigh against each other. So that even though the dollar amount of profits is rising, investors' share of it is falling, which seems to me bodes ill for the investing class in this country.
Seems to be very mixed signals coming at the moment. I know there seems to be people sort of talking up, saying we're through the worst, things are getting better, and some people in very high places in this country. But it does seem to be mixed signals. And when you talk to people who actually run factories, and I've talked to 5 or 6 just in southeast Queensland the last 2 weeks, they're actually all saying they're going backwards slowly.
You'll recall within a couple of months of the American and British invasion of Iraq, Mr. Bush is on an aircraft carrier with the sign behind him saying mission accomplished. Things, to put it mildly, didn't quite turn out the way that he intended.
No.
The reason I mention that is that at the moment, governments, treasurers, prime ministers, senior bureaucrats, in effect, have hoisted the poster saying, with respect to the so-called global financial crisis, mission accomplished, the worst has been averted, there's blue sky ahead, the grass is going to be green, don't you worry about that, don't adjust your sets, nothing here, folks, keep walking along. I think that's dead wrong, that it's encouraged Australians to become complacent. It's papered over a lot of problems, and the trouble, though, with papering over problems is that the problems remain, and when you least expect it, they return and they bite in inconvenient places.
My guest is Chris Leithner from Leithner & Associates. Something happened last week which sort of bears just a little bit, highlighting that the US President Barack Obama, without any sort of public fanfare, just got together with a couple of Treasury officials and increased the amount of debt the US could borrow to something like $14.2 trillion. And some of the media reports from the US said the reason he had to do this was because to prevent them from defaulting on their interest payments on bond loans or bond issues. Is that correct?
Basically, yes. The amount that that the US government can borrow ultimately is set by the US Congress. Now, they have by and large abdicated even the remotest sense of fiscal responsibility. So they simply say to the president, how much do you plan to borrow through the Treasury, through the central bank? Please name your figure. Now,
he upped it by $2 trillion.
He did. Now, and another important point to mention is that that's a relatively regular occurrence. It occurred under George W. Bush on 4 occasions. On each occasion, Republicans, like the trained sheep that they are, voted in favor of it. Now, with a president of a different partisan stripe and a similar magnitude of the increase in the debt, now suddenly they have allegedly become very disciplined and say, things are out of hand and the debt is too high, et cetera, which is perfectly true. The trouble, though, is that this is still a partisan football which has been pushed backwards and forwards.
I want to get to your response to Phil Williams' analysis in just a moment, but before I do that, you flicked me an economic analysis of the debt, the true debt of the nations of the world by an economist with Societe Generale, one of the big European finance houses. And I want to just be sort of fairly brief on this, but basically he implied very heavily that half, if not more, of the G7 countries in the world are actually technically insolvent.
Indeed, he didn't just imply it. I'm looking here at the graph, which is headed, Our Governments Are Insolvent. And the distinction he draws is between what's called on-balance sheet debt. That's literally the amount which they've borrowed, which is a concern. But of even greater concern is what's called off-balance sheet debt. Given the policies with respect to things like social security, pharmaceutical benefits, fighting wars in places which people have trouble finding without an atlas, those are going to incur huge expenses in the next 3, 4, 5 decades or so. Those don't appear on financial statements, so that the official, if you like, debt ceiling of the United States is now 14-point-something trillion. Add on what's off-balance sheet, and the debates rage in terms of the amount, but the bidding begins at about 70 trillion with respect to the United States, which are really, it's difficult for a brain to conceive that sort of a figure right off the top of one's head. Gee, how many zeros?
How many zeros is that?
In a trillion.
I mean, Societe Generale is not some sort of minor finance player. They're one of the major European finance houses. Now, I realise there's only one analyst in their firm, but
it's a team, and I suppose the background over the past roughly 5 years or so, in dribs and drabs, analysts have haltingly come to the realization that, gee, more and more countries, if they're to be private businesses, they'd have to be closed down and the directors arrested for insider trading, as the laws.
But you can't do that to a country, so what do you do?
Well, what they've taken lots of private sector bad debts, mortgages, etc., in the United States, swept them under the rug of the government. The issue now is, well, at what stage do governments go insolvent? So there's questions with respect to Greece, and it's not that Greece per se or Southern Europe is the particular issue, but if Greece is going to be bailed out, then why not Spain? If Spain, then why not Italy? And there comes a certain point when a particular government is simply too big to bail.
That no one will lend to them in the future.
No one will lend to them, apart from exceedingly high rates of interest. We think in terms of a thermostat, which pushes up the thermostat around the world. So in terms of, we talk, well, not you, but people talk forever and a day in terms of greenhouse emissions. The real danger for the world, it seems to me, are greenback emissions. That's to say the amount of dollars floating through. This is funny money. It's not backed by savings. It's issued by governments which think that they can borrow limitless amounts in perpetuity.
Global credit warming.
Well, just alike. And if you like, that the indicators when things get overly warm is that rates of interest, which will be reflected on everything from residential mortgages to the rates which corporations have to pay. There'll be a price to pay for all of this.
Well, we'll watch that with great interest. Now, I flicked you Phil Williams' analysis. It created a great deal of interest amongst my listeners. You don't agree. You agree overall with his general thrust, but you think it was, what's the word, unwise to try and put a time limit on when things may get a bit more difficult. But I think you suggest the term stagflation is something we should prepare for in the future rather than a deflationary depression. What do you mean?
Well, let me define. Inflation is something that neither you or I can create. Trade unions can't do so. Businesses can't do so. There's only one entity which can do so, and it's in Martin Place in Sydney. It's called the Reserve Bank, by creating money. Similarly, in the United States, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England in the UK, etc., etc. To talk about deflation, that's to say a decrease in the amount of these greenback emissions floating around out there, strikes me. It stretches credulity. I have a difficult time believing that. Inflation, that's to say an increase in the supply of money. We've talked about quantitative easing.
Phil Williams was talking about the United States and Europe, I think, in that context.
Right, as far more likely as deflation. So it's a sort of word which can be, depending upon who uses it, it's used in very different ways. One can talk about recessions, depressions. What's the difference between the two? At what stage does one blend into the other? So I suppose one point of disagreement, gee, is this the worst pickle in which the world has been for the past 200 years? Given human beings' capacity to make a mess of things, I hesitate to say that this is the biggest mess in 200 years. And the final point, which you raised, alas, I don't have a crystal ball, and if I did, it wouldn't be a particularly clear one, so that when will particular aspects of this mess really begin to manifest themselves? Is it 6 months? Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? I wish I knew. If I knew, I'd be in a position to defend myself. Alas, I don't know. So it's as if you wake up in the middle of the night, you can't find the bedstand. You know roughly where the position of the furniture in your room is, so you have to tread very carefully to avoid stubbing your toe or stumbling over a lampstand. But that's a far cry from predicting certain things will happen at very specific points in time.
Stagflation plus inflation, does it equal unemployment?
It can do so if the government continues with very crazy policies which basically penalise work. in a free country amongst adults who are able to bargain, that people will. There's no particular reason for unemployment. It may well be that wages have to fall for the simple reason that lots of people have been overpaid in the past, but there's no obvious reason, if the government will step out of the way, that there needs to be mass unemployment. None at all.
I'll speak to you again. We'll pursue this. Chris Leithner, thank you very much.
Thank you.